I'm Rachel Bomberger with Eerdmans Publishing. I'm here today with Thomas Bergler, who is the author of the new book, The Juvenilization of American Christianity. Hi, Tom.
Hi.
Well, I wanted to start out by just asking you a little bit about yourself and the background and experience that brings you to this project.
My background is in college ministry first, then in studying American religious history at Notre Dame, and specifically I studied the history of youth ministry in America.
Now, tell us a little bit, if you could, just in a nutshell, what is the book about?
The book is about the way that youth ministries have impacted American Christianity over the past 75 years. And in the book, I argue that youth ministries have revitalized American Christianity, but at the cost of making American Christians more immature. And I call this process the juvenilization of American Christianity.
So juvenilization, I must admit, I've been struggling with that word all week. Why did you choose that particular word to describe this force that has shaped American Christianity?
I was looking for a word that would describe something becoming more adolescent, more youthful, but that would stress the immaturity dimension of adolescence. So adolescents, everyone acknowledges, are not fully mature human beings. And so I came upon the word juvenilization because it has that meaning of making something youth-like, but in an immature way.
So you're describing basically, in one word, how American Christianity has become very, very adolescent in the last
Right, it's the
few
process
decades.
by which things that might be normal and good for a teenager, spiritually, come to be accepted and even idealized for all ages.
Can you give us some examples of this in real life?
Sure, one example is the spirituality of falling in love with Jesus, which is in books and seminars and often in a lot of music, worship music. And this is something that began amongst teenagers. You can imagine why teenagers are concerned with falling in love. And so youth ministers, in an attempt to appeal to teenagers and to help them understand what a relationship with Jesus was like, they said, aha, let's call it falling in love with Jesus. That's the way the teenagers will understand what we're talking about. But in the process, they reinvented, renamed, re-understood what a relationship with Jesus is really about.
So, in this instance, falling in love with Jesus works as a metaphor for 17-year-olds, not so much for a 65-year-old.
Right, because falling in love is something that is, at least the psychologists tell us, it is something that's temporary, it's highly emotional, it's intense, it's good, there's a sense of devotion to the person that you've fallen in love with, but it's not, those exact feelings are not sustainable in the long term. So, but you wouldn't know that by hearing a lot of Christians talk about how we're supposed to be falling in love and in love with Jesus all the time. And I think this fosters an immature view of our relationship with Christ that says it's primarily about feeling really intense emotions toward Him all the time. And if I'm not, if I am, then everything's okay. And if I'm not feeling intense emotions, then I must have a bad relationship with God.
Now, this book spends a lot of time digging deeply into the history, and I think a lot of people have this conception that these sort of youthful sides of Christianity arose out of the turbulence of the 1960s, but you take it way back further than that and say it really began in the 1930s. Can you tell us about that?
In the 1930s and 1940s, I was amazed to find out that everywhere you looked, people were talking about the youth crisis and the crisis of civilization, that the Great Depression and then World War II and then the Cold War all seemed to involve young people. After all, Hitler was rising to power on the backs of the Hitler Youth. The communists had their own youth movements. It seemed like maybe young people in America would become communists or fascists, or maybe they would become juvenile delinquents. Somehow young people would destroy America if they weren't saved somehow. And this shaped a new era of youth ministries in America that began in the 1930s and 1940s. Churches of all kinds and people of all kinds started founding new ministries and new organizations to help young people. And in the midst of that, one of the things that I saw is that they were willing to try anything to save young people. They weren't too worried about what effects might this have in the long term on the church.
And then you spend a lot of time talking not about the 60s, but the 1950s, a time when we normally think of, of religion being a dominant force in culture, everything's fine, nothing to see here, kind of, in the 50s. Why is this so crucial in the process?
The 1950s was the time that American Christians came up with several ways to deal with youth and youth culture. The 1950s, first of all, was the first time that the United States truly had a national youth culture. And so that was new. Christians of all types were responding to that. What are we going to do with young people? How are we going to help them accept the Christian faith, be strong Christians? Each type of Christian group had different goals for young people, but they all realized that this youth culture is presenting new challenges. Young people today are different. They want different things. They don't seem to be as eagerly embracing the things that we think they should. And so they devised many different strategies for reaching young people and helping them become the kind of Christians that the adults thought they should be. Mm-hmm. So as a result, that 1950s decade was a key time for creating patterns of relating to youth and youth culture that are still with us today.
And then from there, we see these patterns that were set in the 1950s have really continued down to the present, where we see the effects of juvenilization. And what would you say has been the fallout from what happened 50 years ago?
Well, first of all, it's important to remember that I think there have been benefits to this process. For example, I think one of the reasons that church attendance in the United States has remained steady, more or less, over the last 50 years is because of youth ministries and juvenilization. In other words, by making Christianity more youth-friendly, the church has also made it more friendly to Americans in general. As the American population became more adolescent in general, more youthful-minded in general, Christianity continued to have an appeal. If our churches today were still doing the things they did in 1940, they would be empty. So that's one benefit. One of the things that's not so beneficial is this focus on self-development and my problems and my needs as kind of the center of Christian faith. If you ask many Americans, young or old, what do you like about being a Christian? They'll often talk about, well, God helps me with my problems. I feel better. I feel happier. When I go through a hard time, God helps me feel better about it. And these are not bad things. I think the Bible suggests that God wants to help us in those ways. But it's much less common to hear an American Christian say something like, what I love about being a follower of Jesus is that I get to partner with him in his kingdom mission to make the world a better place. That's less common. That's not the first thing that comes out of most people, American Christians' mouths.
There's a lot of I and me,
and
not a lot of Christ.
Just listen to the worship music. It's I and me and you, Jesus, are the main people in there. There's very little we, even.
One of the things that I found really interesting about your book is that even though we think of juvenilization as being something that is has a great effect on the Protestant evangelical churches in America, you say, no, this is something that is a force in all the streams of churches, and you go about showing it. Why did you feel that such a broad approach, applying it to not only evangelicals but also mainline churches, Catholic churches, and black churches, was so important?
I think it's important because I do believe that juvenilization is a process that affects all Christians in America. Even Christians who think that they're keeping it largely at bay are still affected by it. Even churches that have not accommodated much to youth culture, if you visit those churches, if you talk to the leaders and the members of those churches, they will be worried about what's going to happen. Are we appealing to the young people? Is our church just going to have to close its doors in a few years? So even to that extent, they're affected. But secondly, I think it's important to look at the different streams of Christianity because each group responded in a slightly different way. And each of those approaches and responses had a different outcome. And by looking at those different responses to youth culture, different ways of trying to juvenilize, trying to adapt to young people, that will help leaders today be more informed about the decisions they're making.
What do you think is the right way forward?
I think that church leaders need to get together and talk about first of all, what are their ideals for young people? What is it that they want young people to grow up to do and be as Christians? What kind of Christians would they like to see their church produce? Secondly, they need to think about, are the activities and environments and teachings that we give to young people likely to lead to those outcomes or not? And even beyond the focus on the youth ministry, I think churches and leaders in churches need to ask themselves, do we as a church, in all age groups, talk about spiritual maturity as a positive, desirable, and attainable thing in this life? Do we really think that people can become spiritually mature? Would a member of our church see spiritual maturity, see being like Jesus as desirable and attainable? Or do they, like some of my former students, mistakenly equate spiritual maturity with perfection? What does a spiritually mature Christian look like, and how is our church fostering that, providing environments where people can grow up to become more like Jesus?
So, if juvenilization glorifies questing and questioning, the church needs to provide a few more solid answers and a little bit more of a destination point.
Right, and one of the effects of juvenilization is to glorify searching and never finding. Because in adolescence, or increasingly now in emerging adulthood, people are worried about getting stuck in something that won't be right for them. And so they delay committing to something or identifying something of who they want to be or what kind of person they want to become, because they need to keep their options open, because it's going to be a long time before they settle down on something. And that has spilled over into Christianity almost to this extent that people think there isn't really any common Christian ideal of what it means to be a disciple of Jesus, what it means to be like Jesus. And I think people need to realize that becoming like Jesus isn't a restrictive box that God wants to put people in. Becoming spiritually mature follower of Jesus isn't a restrictive box. It's becoming you, but more so. Because you are now the you that you would be if you were the most like Jesus that God intended you to be. So I think we have a vision of spiritual maturity that is narrow and cramped, and I think we need to change that.
So who then should read this book?
I think pastors, youth pastors, anyone who's a leader in a church, parents, people who are concerned about both young people and the church, people who want the church to be welcoming to young people, but don't want the church to be ruled by the worst elements of youth culture, who would like to welcome young people and make them full participants in their churches, and give them the unique things that they need for their age group, but without allowing that to swamp the other things that the church should do and be about.
I think you mentioned at some point the idea that if you want to see where the church is going in 50 years, you look in the youth room.
Right, I think youth ministries are time machines. So if you go to the youth room tonight, you might be able to see some things that will be in your church in 10, 15, 20, 30 years. Because basically what people learn, and the other side of the story is one reason why some young people leave the church after they graduate from high school or youth group is because the adult church isn't enough like the youth group to draw them in. That's why some churches have made the adult church as much like the youth group was as possible, and those churches tend to grow.
Yeah. Well, it's an excellent book, and for me, reading it was, and I think the editor, David Bratt, also felt this, that it was a book where reading it, you feel this aha moment of, this is what I've been seeing, this is what I've observed in my own church and in other churches. I now finally have a name for it.
That's great, thank you.
Again, the book is The Juvenilization of American Christianity, and it's got a lot of really important historical information, but also a vision for a different kind of future for the American churches. Thanks very much.
Thank you.